The night had always carried its own music. In that wild land, silence was a thing no one ever expected. The darkness often echoed with the low growls of beasts, the distant screeches of hunters, or the restless cries of cubs dreaming inside the den. For seasons upon seasons, this was the rhythm of the forest. Life moved with tension, each breath a warning that danger lurked nearby. But on this night, something was different. The air carried no growl, no cry, no threat. The ground felt calm. The trees stood still, and even the stars seemed to shine more softly, as though watching carefully over what was about to unfold. Inside the den, the predator cubs slept. Their small chests rose and fell slowly, their tiny paws twitching, as if chasing shadows in dreams. To anyone who had watched them before, this quiet scene would have felt almost unreal. Normally, cubs like them stirred at every rustle. They whimpered when the night air carried the scent of danger, or when their alpha had not yet returned from the hunt. But tonight, none of that happened. Tonight, they slept in peace, unaware of the world beyond. The reason for that calmness stood outside the den. A group of humans had taken positions around the clearing, their boots pressed into the earth, their eyes scanning the darkness. They did not speak loudly. They did not move without thought. They simply stood watch. Some leaned against the trees, their weapons held but not raised. Others shifted slowly, stretching their tired limbs while keeping their gaze fixed outward. They were not intruders nor conquerors. They were guardians, and though no one had asked them to guard, they had chosen to. For the first time in many nights, the land itself seemed to exhale. No predators prowled near the den, no rival raiders dared step into the shadows of that clearing. It was not because of traps or threats, it was because of the humans. There was something in their stillness, something in the way they held themselves, that told every watching creature, not tonight. The alpha of the cubs, though resting deeper within the den, felt it too. His instincts were sharp, honed through years of survival, and yet even he did not stir with the same unease that had haunted him before. In the past, he had returned from hunts with tension in his muscles, his senses sharp, his mind racing with the thought of unseen dangers near his young. But on this night, he lowered his head and rested longer than usual. Some part of him, perhaps, against his own nature, trusted the stillness beyond the walls of stone and earth. The humans themselves were not unshaken. They were tired. Hours of standing in the cold bit into their bones, the wind stung their cheeks, and the quiet pressed heavily on their minds. Yet none left their place. Each man and woman there knew why they had stayed. It was not out of duty to their kind alone, nor out of obligation to the predators within the den. It was something deeper, something simple, human, a feeling that young lives, no matter whose they were, deserved a night of safety. The night stretched slowly. Shadows shifted as the moon moved across the sky. Once in a while, a twig snapped in the forest, or a bird called from far away. Each time. The humans turned their eyes toward the sound, steady and calm, ready if danger showed itself. But nothing came close. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps the forest itself had understood their presence. Predators who once would have crept near kept their distance, unsettled by the silent figures standing guard. Raiders who might have thought of striking in the dark instead chose to vanish, unwilling to test the resolve they saw before them. And so the cubs slept. Their tiny breaths puffed into the air of the den, their bodies curled together in warmth. They did not know the effort being made for them. They did not know the cold feet of the humans outside, or the long hours spent with no rest. They did not know that their safety was being bought with patience and silence, but perhaps in some unspoken way they felt it. Perhaps that was why their dreams were calm. One of the humans, standing with his back against a rough tree trunk, let his eyes drift to the stars. He thought of home, far away from this place. He thought of his own family, of the children he once carried on his shoulders, of the nights he had stood awake to guard his own. That memory gave him strength. It reminded him that protection, no matter where or for whom, was a bond that crossed boundaries. A cub was a cub, no matter the species, and a night of peace was worth the tiredness that tomorrow would bring. Another human, younger and less seasoned, shifted uneasily. She had not done this before. She wondered why they were there, why they risked their time and energy for creatures who might never even know their names. But as she listened to the silence, she realized that it mattered. The very fact that the night was still, that no cry of fear rose from the den, was proof enough. Her doubts faded, replaced by a quiet pride. The hours dragged on, but none complained. Their breaths joined the rhythm of the night, steady and unbroken. Their shadows blended with the trees. In their presence, the clearing became something rare in such a wild world. A sanctuary. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the stillness held. The cubs stirred, stretching their small limbs, blinking sleepily as the light crept into their den. Outside, the humans remained, weary, but unyielding. They had done what they came to do. The night had passed without conflict, without loss, without fear. That in itself was a victory, though no banner would be raised to mark it. The cubs would never know the silent wall that had stood between them and danger. The alpha would never thank the humans directly. And yet, the story had already begun to take shape. Somewhere in the forest, whispers would grow. The night had been silent, not because the world was empty, but because humans had stood guard. And that truth, quiet, unspoken, yet powerful, was what made the night unforgettable. The forest was still, but the silence did not mean safety. Every shadow could be hiding eyes. Every gust of wind might carry the scent of a hunter. And yet, the humans remained in their places, forming an invisible circle around the den. This was not their land, not their home, not even their species they were protecting, but they stood anyway. The night belonged to them now, not because they controlled it, but because they watched it. The human watch had begun hours earlier, as the sun dipped low and the cubs had curled themselves into sleep. At first, it had felt strange to stand so close to creatures who, by nature, would have once hunted them. The cubs were predators, destined to grow into strong and fierce beings. The alpha, who rested deeper inside the den, had eyes sharp enough to unsettle even the bravest heart. But despite all this, the humans did not see enemies before them. They saw lives worth guarding. Each human had taken a post, careful not to make unnecessary noise. They had trained themselves to move softly, to breathe with control, to make their presence both visible and invisible at once. Their presence warned off any intruders, but their stillness comforted the cubs inside. There was no banging of metal, no shouts into the dark, only a steady quiet. The watch was not easy. Hours passed slowly in the cold air, muscles ached from standing in place, and minds drifted between alertness and exhaustion. The forest, while calm, was never truly safe. More than once a distant howl echoed through the trees, and the humans turned their heads sharply, hands tightening on their weapons. But the danger never came closer. It was as if the wild itself respected the wall they had formed. One of the humans, tall and weathered by time, shifted his weight from one leg to the other. His eyes had grown used to scanning darkness, finding patterns in shadows. He had stood on many nights like this before, nights of watchfulness, nights of quiet, duty. This one felt different, though. As he looked toward the den where the cubs slept without fear, he felt a warmth that the cold could not touch. He thought of his own childhood, when his elders had stood guard to protect him. Now he was repeating that act, not for his kind, but for another. Another human, younger and less certain, felt the weight of the silence pressing on her shoulders. She wondered if it was worth it. After all, the cubs were not theirs. They belonged to a species that would grow to dominate the same forest, to claim its power with tooth and claw. But as the night deepened, she listened to the sound of their breathing from inside the den, soft and unbroken, and her doubts faded. Peace was rare in such a world. To know she was part of giving it, even for a single night, felt like purpose enough. Time stretched on. The moon climbed high and painted silver light across the clearing. The trees stood tall like silent guards, beside the humans. The wind carried faint scents of faraway prey and predators, but none dared come near. Perhaps they sensed that this was not a night for hunting. Perhaps they had seen the humans standing firm and chose to move elsewhere. The watch was not only about guarding the cubs, it was also about guarding each other. Every so often, one human would glance at another, a silent exchange of strength passing between them. They were not alone in this. They stood as one, and that unity gave them power. No words were spoken, yet they all understood. No danger would break this circle tonight. As the hours passed, the weight of tiredness grew heavier. The cold air bit deeper into their skin, and their bodies longed for rest. But no one allowed themselves to falter. Each human knew the cost of lowering their guard. One moment of weakness could mean the end of the peace they had built. And so they endured, holding themselves steady against the pull of exhaustion. At one point, the alpha stirred within the den. His massive shape shifted, and his eyes opened, glowing faintly in the dark. He looked toward the entrance, where the humans stood. For a moment, tension hung in the air. The alpha had always been the protector, the one who kept his young safe from harm. To see another species standing in his place, watching over his cubs, was not something he had expected. But he did not growl, did not rise to chase them away. Instead, after a long pause, he lowered his head again and closed his eyes. In his own way, he acknowledged their presence. For that night, he trusted them. The humans felt the weight of that trust, though unspoken. It was not a bond formed by words or promises. It was formed by action, by the simple fact that the cubs slept soundly while they watched. That trust became another reason to hold their ground. As midnight turned toward dawn, the forest seemed to grow heavier with silence. Even the insects that usually hummed in the dark were quieter than usual. The humans noticed this, and it only sharpened their senses. Silence could mean peace, but it could also mean danger hiding close. Still, no threat came. The hours passed, with nothing but the steady rhythm of their breathing, the shifting of their weight, and the soft sighs of sleeping cubs. In the stillness, some of the humans found themselves reflecting on why they were there. One remembered the stories told around fires, of how humans had always survived by standing together, by protecting their young no matter the cost. Another thought of how fragile life was, how easily it could be lost in a single careless moment. Another felt a strange sense of pride, knowing that for this one night they had become part of something larger than themselves. There were no witnesses to honor them. No songs would be sung about the long hours they spent in silence. But they did not need recognition. Their reward was in the quiet itself, in knowing that while the world outside the clearing carried danger, inside it there was peace. At last, the first light of dawn began to touch the sky. The humans stood weary, their eyes heavy, their limbs stiff. But as the golden glow crept across the trees, they knew they had succeeded. The cubs stirred inside the den, stretching their small bodies, blinking at the new day. They had slept safely through the night, untouched by fear. The human watch had done what it set out to do, without a single word, without a single step into the den. They had given the cubs something priceless, a night of calm, a memory of peace that would live within them, even if they never understood why. And as the humans finally prepared to leave their posts, fading back into the forest, the story of their watch was already written, not in books or speeches, but in the quiet hearts of those who had lived it. The night had been silent, because humans had stood guard. The night had passed, and with the first light of dawn, the cubs stretched and blinked, unaware of the sacrifice made for their safety. But outside the den, in the trees, in the brush, and hidden in the shadows, others had been watching. Not all were friends, and not all carried trust in their hearts. The forest was never empty. Even when humans stood guard, even when silence felt heavy and unbroken, there were always eyes. Some belonged to curious creatures who did not understand what they were seeing. Others belonged to rivals, predators who wondered why humans would risk themselves for cubs that were not their own. And then there were the elders of the predator kind, watching from afar, hidden in the darkness, trying to make sense of this strange alliance. The first reaction had been confusion. For generations, predators and humans had lived in a tense balance, sometimes avoiding one another, sometimes clashing when territory overlapped. Never before had humans chosen to guard predator young. Never had they stood outside a den, through cold and darkness, offering their strength to keep another species safe. To the watchers in the shadows, it seemed impossible. Why would humans do this? What could they gain? Some assumed it was weakness. They whispered among themselves in low growls and quiet clicks. Perhaps humans were soft, too gentle to survive without clinging to others. Perhaps this strange act was nothing more than desperation. If that was true, then they believed it would not last. In time, the humans would grow tired, would turn away, and balance would return. But as the hours dragged on, the shadows saw no weakness. The humans did not falter. They did not abandon their posts. They did not move from the circle they had made. Even when the forest called with hunger, even when the cold gnawed at their bones, they stood firm. And slowly, those in the shadows began to see something different. There was one watcher, an older predator with scars running down its flank, proof of many battles. From its hiding place among the trees, it studied the humans with unblinking eyes. At first, it had waited for them to break. It had thought the long night would wear them down, that their legs would shake, their eyes would close, their hands would slip from their weapons. But none of these things happened. When dawn came, the humans were still there, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, breathing steady. And in that moment, the old predator felt something unusual: respect. Others reacted with suspicion. To them, kindness was never free. If humans guarded the cubs, it must mean they sought power in return. Maybe they hoped to control the alpha by winning his trust. Maybe they planned to raise the cubs as their own, shaping them into weapons. Suspicion ran deep in their minds, because they had never known selfless protection. In their world, nothing came without cost. Yet when dawn touched the sky and the humans slipped quietly back into the forest without asking for thanks, even those filled with suspicion were unsettled. Why leave without reward? Why walk away after such effort with nothing gained? Their suspicions did not vanish, but cracks formed in their certainty. Perhaps they had misjudged. And then there were the curious ones, the young, the restless, the ones who had never seen war with humans. They whispered to each other in the dark, their eyes wide with wonder. They asked questions their elders could not answer. Why would humans guard cubs that were not theirs? Why risk themselves when the forest could have taken them? To the young, it felt like a story, something larger than life. Some even dreamed that this act meant something new was beginning, something different from the old ways of fear and rivalry. As the sun rose higher, the whispers of the night did not fade. They grew, spreading from one group of watchers to another. The story traveled, told in fragments and murmurs. Humans had guarded predator cubs through the night. The words carried disbelief, awe, and uncertainty. Each time the story was retold, reactions shifted slightly, but the core remained the same. Something unusual had happened, something no one had expected. The Alpha, too, had sensed these reactions. Even from inside the den, he could feel the eyes in the shadows, watching, judging. He knew the weight of their stares, the questions in their hearts. For a leader, appearances mattered, strength mattered. To allow humans to stand watch over his young might have been seen as weakness. But he had felt the truth in his bones. There was no weakness in accepting their help. There was strength in trust. When he had closed his eyes again during the night, it had not been out of carelessness. It had been a choice. He had allowed himself to rest because he knew the humans were there. And in doing so, he had given a silent answer to those in the shadows. His acceptance of the humans was his command, and though some might doubt, none dared question him aloud. The humans themselves did not know how much they were being watched. They thought their vigil had been quiet, unseen, forgotten by the rising sun. But in truth, their actions had rippled far beyond the clearing. Even as they walked back into the forest, stiff with exhaustion, their silent watch was being weighed, judged and remembered by countless eyes. For some, it stirred fear. What if humans were no longer bound by their own survival alone? What if they extended their protection beyond their own kind? That kind of strength could not be predicted, could not be controlled. It frightened those who lived by dominance and power. For others, it stirred hope. If humans could stand guard over cubs not their own, then maybe old wounds could heal. Maybe enemies did not have to remain enemies forever. The thought was dangerous, almost unbelievable. But it was there, whispering in the hearts of the curious. In the shadows, reactions were not just words. They were decisions waiting to be made. Some predators decided they would test the humans, searching for weakness. Others decided they would watch longer, see if the act repeated. And some decided to keep the memory close, as a seed of change, that might one day grow. What none of them knew was how far that seed would reach. For in the quiet of that night, the humans had done more than guard a den. They had shown that kindness could exist where no one expected it. And even if the cubs never remembered, even if the Alpha never spoke of it, the shadows had seen, and the shadows would not forget. The forest kept its secrets, but stories had a way of spreading. And this story, born in silence, guarded by human hands, was now alive in the whispers of the dark. The first light of dawn broke slowly over the horizon. At first it was just a faint silver glow pressing against the edge of the dark sky. Then it grew, warming into soft streaks of orange and gold. The forest, which only hours earlier had been, cloaked in uneasy silence, now began to stir. A cool breeze carried the scent of dew-soaked grass, and far away, a bird gave its first call of the morning. The night had been long. For the cubs inside the den, it had passed in perfect peace. They lay huddled against one another, tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths, unaware of the tension that had surrounded them. They did not hear the shifting of armor outside, or the faint sound of boots pressing into damp soil, or the constant watchfulness of eyes that had refused to close. The cubs only knew warmth, comfort, and the quiet protection of slumber. The Alpha stirred as the first strands of light slipped through the gaps of the rocky den. His powerful body stretched, muscles shifting under thick fur, but his movements carried an unusual ease this morning. His ears flicked, catching the faintest rustle of leaves and the distant whisper of wind, yet he did not rise with the sharp urgency that usually ruled his mornings. For the first time in many seasons, he had slept without fear. He had allowed himself to rest because others had stood watch, and they had not failed. Outside, the humans shifted as dawn reached them. Their eyes were heavy, burning from hours of sleeplessness, but none complained. Some leaned on their weapons, some stood tall despite aching limbs, but all of them remained fixed in their duty until the light grew stronger. They had kept their promise. Not a sound, not a threat, had touched the cubs during the night. When the Alpha stepped out of the den, the forest fell into a soft hush. His golden eyes scanned the humans, their tired faces, their still posture, and something inside him stirred. He had lived long enough to know strength when he saw it, and courage too. But what struck him most was not strength, it was patience. These humans, fragile in body compared to his kind, had stood unmoving through the long hours of darkness, not for themselves, but for his young. The cubs tumbled after him, stretching and yawning, their small teeth flashing as they blinked at the brightening day. They did not understand what had taken place. To them, the night had been like any other, soft and quiet. But the humans knew, and so did the Alpha. One of the older warriors among the humans lowered his weapon and let out a slow breath. "They're safe," he whispered, though the words were spoken more to himself than to anyone else. Another nodded, a tired smile crossing his face. For them, exhaustion was worth this moment, the sight of innocent lives waking without fear. The Alpha looked at the cubs, then at the humans. For a brief moment, the world felt suspended, balanced between two species who had once known only suspicion of each other. The silence between them was heavy, but not with hostility. It was the weight of realization. The Alpha realized that he had been wrong to think humans acted only from self-interest. They had proven, through the long, cold night, that they could protect as fiercely as any pack leader. And the humans realized that these creatures, often painted as ruthless predators, carried tenderness and love for their young just as deeply as any family on Earth. One of the cubs stumbled forward, curious, its tiny paws carrying it toward the humans. The Alpha tensed, instinct urging him to pull the young one back, but then he stopped. He allowed the cub to take those few unsteady steps, to sniff the air, to look at the strange figures who had guarded it while it dreamed. The humans did not move. They stood still, respectful, letting the cub satisfy its curiosity without fear. And when the little one lost interest and bounded back to its siblings, a quiet smile flickered across more than one tired face. The morning grew brighter, and the forest began to hum with life again. Birds called to each other, insects buzzed, and the trees swayed gently. Yet for those who had lived through the night, the world seemed different. The Alpha lowered his head slightly, not a bow, not surrender, but something close to acknowledgement. It was an unspoken gesture, a silent recognition of what had been given. The humans exchanged glances, understanding its meaning without the need for words. Respect had been earned, not demanded. Trust had been planted, fragile but real. As the day stretched on, the humans began to leave their posts, their steps heavy, but their spirits light. They had come to guard, and they had done so without hesitation. Now, as they turned toward their camp, they carried with them a sense of quiet pride, the kind that comes not from victory, but from service. The Alpha watched them go, his cubs playing at his paws, and felt something shift inside him. Perhaps, he thought, strength was not only measured in teeth and claws, but also in patience, in sacrifice, and in the quiet choices made when no one was watching. For the humans, too, the realization lingered. They had seen into the heart of another species, into their fears, their loves, their vulnerabilities. And in doing so, they had glimpsed a reflection of themselves. The night had been silent, but its silence carried meaning. It was not the silence of fear, nor of emptiness. It was the silence of guardianship, of lives protected, of a bond quietly beginning to form under the stars. As the sun climbed higher, the memory of that night settled deep within both humans and predators alike. It would be told and retold, not as a tale of war, but as a story of watchfulness, of respect, and of the moment two worlds realized they shared something greater than they had ever believed. And though the cubs would not remember the details, though they would grow and run and hunt without recalling who stood outside their den that night, the legacy of that dawn would remain. For sometimes the smallest lives, the quietest nights, carry the weight of the greatest truths. The days after that night passed quietly, but the memory of it did not fade. The humans went back to their duties, their routines of survival, yet there was something different in the way they carried themselves. They had not won a battle. They had not conquered land, but they had done something greater, something that could not be measured in trophies or records. They had given safety where fear had lived, and in that act, they had built a legacy stronger than any wall. The cubs grew quickly, as young ones always do. Their paws became steadier, their steps turned into leaps, and their playful growls filled the den with energy. To them, the night of silence was nothing more than a forgotten dream. They never knew how close danger had been, how fragile their safety was, or how strangers had stood in the cold to guard their sleep. Yet even if they did not remember, the world around them carried that memory for them. The Alpha never spoke of it aloud, but he remembered. He remembered the heavy silence of that night, the steady eyes of the humans, and the way his cubs woke to the morning without a trace of fear. He had led his pack through storms, through hunger, through battles that tested every ounce of his strength. But that night had taught him something new, that even a leader cannot protect everything alone. Trust, though fragile, could sometimes be the strongest shield. For the humans, the story spread quietly, carried not by songs or speeches, but by whispers between watchmen, by words shared over campfires. They did not boast of it, because it was not a tale of victory to parade. It was a memory held with care, like a candle shielded from the wind. One would say, "Do you remember the night we stood for them?" And another would nod, their eyes softening, because they knew. The legacy of that night lived in silence. No monument was built, no mark carved into stone. Instead, it lived in the way the humans walked a little taller, in the way they understood the value of life, even when it was not their own kind. It lived in the way they looked at the cubs when they passed by the den and saw them playing in the sunlight. There was pride there, but also humility. Generations would come, and many would forget the details. The cubs would grow into strong hunters, perhaps leaders themselves. They would chase prey through the forest, raise families, and tell their own stories. They would not remember the night humans stood watch outside their den, but deep inside, a strange calm would remain with them. A quiet trust carried through the blood of their kind. Among the humans, too, time would move forward. Those who had stood guard would grow older, their faces marked by years, their hands roughened by labor. Some would leave. Some would be replaced by younger ones who had not seen that night. Yet the story would live on, not written in books, but carried in the way the older ones spoke to the new. There are times, they would say, when strength is not about fighting. Sometimes it is about waiting. Sometimes it is about standing still. The younger ones would not fully understand, not until they found themselves in their own moment of silence, protecting lives that could not protect themselves. Then they would understand what it meant. The legacy of that night was not about humans or predators alone. It was about what happened when two worlds, once separate, touched for a moment. It was about the unspoken bond that formed in the shadows, when fear could have ruled, but did not. It was about the quiet courage that does not seek reward. One evening, Seasons later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and painted the sky with red and gold, one of the cubs, now grown, taller and stronger, stood at the edge of the forest. It looked out at the human camp in the distance. The shapes of guards were visible, standing as still as statues. For a long moment, the young hunter watched them, and though it did not know why, it felt no anger, no fear, only calm. The humans did not see it watching. They kept their eyes fixed on the shadows, their weapons ready, their bodies steady. They did not know the young predator stood nearby, remembering without memory, feeling the echo of a night it could not recall. Yet in that moment, the silent legacy was alive again. It lived in the trust that lingered in the air, in the invisible thread woven between human and predator. It was not spoken, not written, not celebrated, but it was there, a legacy built not from power but from mercy, not from words but from silence. And so the story continued, not as a tale of war or conquest, but as a quiet reminder. Sometimes the strongest moments are the ones no one sees. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that leave no sound. The night had been silent once, and because of that silence, lives had been saved, respect had been born, and a bond had been created. That was the legacy, silent, lasting, and stronger than any roar.